We're here with Chris Sauter in his studio to talk about his upcoming exhibition at Blue Star, which is your response to your experience in Berlin and things that have happened since that time.
Right.
So why don't we start with talking about what's right here in front of us, which is directly from the streets of Berlin, and kind of how you amass the material and what is the inspiration for the works that use this material.
Okay, well, I visited Berlin for the residency at the Battalion, and upon getting off the plane and driving in on the cab, I was really struck by the amount of visual information in the city, because every surface of the city seemed to be covered in street posters and graffiti. And I thought, how can one be an artist in a city where you're surrounded by imagery all the time? And I just kept thinking about those posters. I mean, I just want to delete the posters. That's what I want to do. I want to delete them. And because I had, part of my approach has often been to cut into surfaces to make things, I thought, well, maybe I should just cut into the images and remove the images, and if I cut, which would the shape be, and da, da, da. So I was thinking about it, and I came to this idea of making loudspeakers. So I started going out into the streets and pulling huge stacks of posters off of the walls and bringing them back to the studio. And the reason why I say huge stacks of posters is because they don't take the old poster off before they put the new poster on. They just accrue, and eventually they get so thick that their own weight pulls them off the wall. And so you get these gigantic stacks of the history of the city in kind of a microcosm of the history of the city. And so I take these stacks and carve into them, cut these shapes out, and then use these shapes to create these loudspeakers that were then attached back to the poster, if they weren't already attached. And then while I was in Berlin, the second half of that project was to take the posters in and return them back where I got them with the loudspeaker, and just leave them there, photograph them there, document them, and then leave them and let the city deal with them. And that was really fun and interesting for me because people did notice them. And there are so many posters now that people kind of ignore the posters and they don't see them anymore. And so suddenly they were seeing the posters again. So in some ways my project was the opposite of what I wanted to do. Instead of deleting the posters, I was making people look at them again. So I bundled up a bunch of the posters at the end of my residency in Berlin, stuck them into a box, as many as I could fit into this like $80 a euro or 80 euro shipping box, and shipped them to myself. And so I've been continuing the project here, cutting into them and making the loudspeakers, but not putting them out in the street, just using them as objects to talk about communication. For this one, I decided to do a single loudspeaker, and I placed it here because it related interestingly to the train. And then we have the two figures up here. I didn't want to get rid of them either because their bodies are really important because they're so interesting. I oriented the pieces so that they would mimic kind of sound waves, and they're placed in the image so that important parts don't get taken away. So we can still read the poster with these pieces missing. And so when I cut through, I'm just pressing as hard as I can, cutting through, and then the posters kind of release the way they want to, and I discover interesting things. For instance, here you can see there's a map, a black and white map, and then this flag here that says "off!" exclamation point. So it's interesting to have this information now juxtaposed with this information of these two people in kind of bondage gear. From there, and so you have this unheilig, which means unholy, next to im Keller, which means in the cellar or in the basement, and you have these people doing this thing, these secret kind of taboo things, and then you have the word bad, and then this political map, and so all those things start to generate and become this really interesting meaning. And then the word Gipfelstürmer right here means like someone who storms to the top of a mountain. And so it has some Nazi connotations as well. So there's all this really interesting content that's generated through placing through the juxtaposition of these two posters, plus also carving into them and seeing what's coming out. Like this image that's showing through here is the same image here, so there must be the glue wasn't as good that day or something. And so when I cut, I keep coming to the same poster. That happens a lot. You start to see the connections between the unholy and the things people do in their basements and politics, and so there's all this kind of complexity that happens just in the posters themselves. Mm-hmm. And then now, of course, since we've elected the person that we've elected for president, our whole notions of communication and information and truth are all in question and complicated. And so I feel like now that content really informs how one would look at these posters, because these posters, although they're a reaction to the information that's given by the poster, now it's really talking about the complexity of information mm-hmm. and the delivery of information and mm-hmm. how that kind of can be manipulated through juxtaposition or through removal or through hidden words or all the president has to do is say one word or one catchphrase, and people lay on that catchphrase anything they want it to mean, mm-hmm. right? So when he says, "Make America Great Again," that means something radically different for me than it does for someone else, maybe, in rural Kentucky. That information delivery system is affecting, our political climate and the way we understand facts, etc. So I think that these, even though they were a simple response to street posters in Berlin, are now able to communicate about much more complex ideas.
So in talking about the form of the speaker and the poster and how those talk about communication in general or mm-hmm. the dissemination of information, you're also pairing it with this, or a component of this,
right.
This piece here, which mm-hmm. you've a form or an image that you've used multiple times, right. Throughout your practice. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that a little bit, about kind of that sending and receiving of information, mm-hmm. and also kind of the reuse of this this icon, I guess? Yeah.
So this object back here is kind of a miniature version of a radio telescope. And radio telescopes are used to listen to signals that emanate from deep space so that we can get a good picture of the origins of the universe. And so the idea was to pair this object that's about active listening, receiving, next to objects that are about projecting, about broadcasting information. So you get two sides of a circuit, right? You have the listening and the talking. And so I'm going to pair this object, this radio telescope, with these three-dimensional letters that spell out the word want. And so they'll function as like a pedestal for the object. And so my hope is that this object, paired with the phrase want, or the word want, with these posters will generate in the viewer this kind of questioning of the flow of information.